McFarlane. Welcome to the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. With me today as co-pilot is Dr. Irma McClaurin. She is the Culture and Education Editor for Insight News, a scholar, an anthropologist, an accomplished human being. Irma, good to see you as always. Thank you for joining me today.
Always glad to be here.
Well, we're going to have two important conversations. Our first is going to be focusing on environmental concerns. We're going to be joined by Paul Gardner in just a moment and his work around the Minnesota Clean Water Council. And also talk about some other activist water information as well. And then in the later part of the program, we're going to be joined by Minnesota Senator Tina Smith. Obviously, that'll be a great conversation. But first, how are you? What's on your mind? What's top of mind in your view of community and of the world as we speak?
Well, the topic is of interest to me because, believe it or not, exactly almost 24 years ago, when I was a American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Fellow, working as a diplomacy fellow at USAID in Washington, D.C., one of my colleagues told me that the next issue on the horizon was going to be water. So the fact that we're talking about it now, I'm actually in Louisiana, New Orleans, and they're having lots of problems with it being so dry. They've banned people from burning things. They banned people from actually doing backyard grilling because they don't want anything to spark a fire. Mm-hmm. So this dryness, the fact that, rivers are receding and starting to drop, climate change is also part of this conversation. So it's not just about clean water. It's about all the things that feed into it. And one of the things when I was in Brazil and doing research that I discovered 2/3 of the entire landmass of the United States is water. So water is very big. And I don't think most people know that. So this is an important conversation because we need to be more mindful about how significant water is, not only to us individually and collectively, but to the entire, continent that we live on, the United States of America.
Well, Paul Gardner, you're a stakeholder. Welcome to the conversation, and let's let you take it from there. What is your work at Minnesota Clean Water Council?
Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I appreciate it very much. My name is Paul Gardner. I'm the administrator for the Minnesota Clean Water Council. I happen to be an employee because they had to put me somewhere at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, so I have the swag. But the Clean Water Council is a group of 28 people. 17 of them are citizens appointed by the governor, and they make recommendations according to statute for how to use the Clean Water Fund, which is 1/3 of the revenue from the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment. When Minnesotans raised their sales tax by 0.3% in 2008. And that money lasts for 25 years. Who's on the council is determined by statute. It's a good group of people from different areas of the state, everything from local government to business to farmers and environmental groups.
But I had asked Paul, I had pointed out to him just a little bit before the show that as I'm scanning the list of representation on that group, that I noticed that indigenous people, Native Americans who have actually been stewards of our environment, and particularly in Minnesota, where I think they're between 10 and 12% of the population, are glaringly absent.
Well, you're correct. So the seats that are represented by those 17 members are set up in statute for particular constituencies, but don't even have at-large members. We do have one tribal government seat. We have had one critique or numerous critiques like yours, even people saying, well, how can one person even represent all indigenous people in the state? Of course, for someone like me and my background, we're often guilty of grouping everybody together as if everybody's the same, which of course is not true. We have Dakota and Ojibwe Minnesotans, and of course we have people in Minneapolis and the Little Earth community who come from all over the country. So even though we have tribal government liaisons of sorts, I've discovered that indigenous people will often say, well, I don't necessarily agree with everything tribal government says either. And now you have just one to represent 11 or 12 different entities. But I will say the governor and lieutenant governor issued an executive order in 2019 requiring all major state agencies to have a consultation process with tribal governments on issues that affect them. So the Pollution Control Agency Commissioner, the DNR Commissioner, and others, they go out regularly and do a circuit to all the tribal communities just to hear what's in people's mind. And it's a very defined process. I've also taken state tribal relations training. Actually, it was just before COVID hit, and it was just a transformational training. I've never taken such a good class in my life, where I thought I knew what I was talking about, but I did not know what I was talking about, particularly on control of land, which has everything to do with water.
Right.
So the Clean Water Fund actually does, the agencies that get Clean Water Fund money do a lot of collaboration with the tribes, particularly in the northern half of the state. And in some cases, we have decided that we are not going to control certain information, the tribes will. And so it's been a very interesting experience for all of us. And of course, for indigenous people, they're like, what took you so long? But
Yeah.
totally understandable. But we are getting somewhere.
Well, Irma, I love the direction of the question, because in my general observation in Minnesota and probably around the country, when there's a general discussion about air quality, water quality, environmental issues, there's a presumption that this is out of the realm of interest of poor people in general, but Black people in particular, and other people of color. And so you raised a specific question about the indigenous populations here. And I wonder, does the council, does the movement as it exists across the country, as well as in its iteration in Minnesota, pay particular attention to bridging, creating awareness and creating a sense of equity about water and clean water for all communities? What is being done, what has been done to translate the challenges and opportunities to Black people in North Minneapolis or South Minneapolis or Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul and other people of color wherever we exist? Any discussion around that, Paul?
We have. In fact, even before the murder of George Floyd, the council was having some presenters on topics of equity, everything from women in farming to indigenous knowledge about water. And we also had a speaker who's a state employee who's African-American and owns the family farm in Alabama. Mm-hmm. And he gave a presentation about the Pigford civil rights case, which was the largest monetary award for a civil rights case in U.S. history at the time, over discriminatory policies by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which kept Black and indigenous farmers from getting access to financing. And so a lot of Black farmers lost their land. His farm was an exception in that area, but that really hit home for us. But we deal a lot with agriculture in Minnesota and water quality, but there are virtually no Black farmers. That has started to change. The U.S. or the State Department of Agriculture has been working on assisting emerging farmers, whether they're from emerging communities, they're African American or indigenous farmers or women. So we're seeing a little bit more diversity than we have had, which has been a pretty homogenous group of people.
Well, you mentioned it already. Take a minute and talk about how the fund, what the fund is, and how it's used. Where does the money go?
Sure. So that 0.3% sales tax generates a lot of money. In the last, and the legislature actually appropriates our recommendations, or at least they hope they do all of it. In this current biennium for a 2-year budget, there's $321 million that's being used for clean water. That goes into a variety of things, some of which we're required to do and couldn't do because we didn't have the money, and some things we're doing things in a very systematic way so that nobody's left out. So we're putting about 15% of that money into monitoring to actually look for more contaminants in more places. That includes everything from bacteria that might come from farm runoff to stormwater that's in the city and in suburban and urban areas. Stormwater is actually our key priority in the Twin Cities Metro. We spend a little bit on planning to make sure that we get everybody together with all these layers of government we have and communities to make sure we're focusing on the right priorities, because we can't fix all of our waters, but we do focus on the highest priorities like drinking water sources and recreational lakes, for example. And then we kind of work upstream to figure out what the problem is. And then we fund fixes of all kinds and then measure to see if we've actually done the fix. There are cases where the Clean Water Council doesn't do stuff like infrastructure. We don't fund pipes, we do a little bit of water, wastewater treatment, but not much. But after the debacle in Flint, Michigan, where a majority community of color was exposed to lead, especially children, the Clean Water Council insisted on recommending money for Minnesota so that we could actually figure out what it would cost to get rid of all lead in our drinking water system in Minnesota. And that was the first of its kind analysis that said, here's what the cost is for getting rid of lead pipes. Here's what the benefit is. And it turns out that for every dollar you invest in getting rid of lead pipes, you get $2 in benefit from improved public health, children doing better in school and in life. And Representative Sidney Jordan from Minneapolis actually flogged around our report everywhere at the legislature this year when legislators appropriated $240 million to actually dig out all those old pipes and remove them. And we're getting some matching federal money. So while the Clean Water Fund didn't fund the removal of the pipes, we did the intellectual work to figure out what it would take to do it. And then that made everything easier when the money was available.
And Paul, when that money is made available, is the work being done in the communities that are adversely affected, or does it go to the people? I mean, you have a majority white council that's making decisions, and clearly their self-interest is going to come into play. I mean, as objective, quote unquote, as people like to think they are, the reality is that people operate out of self-interest. So if Black people are not highly represented, you've got one Black member, one Native American member, and then you've got everybody else, 98% is white. How do we make sure that those communities that are most adversely impacted and would suffer the most harm actually are the ones at the top of the line or at the front of the line instead of always at the tail end, which is historically what has happened?
Right. So the way in which we allocate the money is science-based initially. So we figure out where the problems are, and they exist in the core cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the suburbs and farm country and up north. The more you disturb the land, the more the water quality degrades. So southern Minnesota and the Red River Valley have some of the poorest quality water because we've scarred the land. So I shouldn't say we scarred it, but we've drained it and we farmed it, and so a lot of stuff comes off the field. In a city, the issue is stormwater. So there are also multiple benefits of treating stormwater that do things like having more green space in an area that has been paved, and usually lower income communities have less shade trees, for example. So things like tree trenches, which help infiltrate water along streets, also provide trees and shade and the cooling effect. I just read a book about heat stress and how people around the world who generally have fewer resources are less able to deal with heat with the either expensive air conditioning or no air conditioning, no shade. Whereas my suburb community here has got temperatures that are probably 10 degrees lower in the summer. So there are multiple benefits of treating stormwater by having less impervious surface, less stuff to reflect off, more ways to collect water and treat it before it goes somewhere. I will say that the science-based way we go about it does do one nice thing, which it generally keeps the politics out of it. Which has its pros and cons. We saw in the legislature this year how with the bonding bill, a lot of legislators from the Twin Cities Metro and a very diverse group said the process we've done for bonding isn't working. It's primarily gone to areas not in our communities. And so they earmarked a lot of funds to assist organizations in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is a just solution.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people said, it didn't go through the right or the certain process that we've had. And so it's caused some reflection as to whether that's the system they want. We
And
have
I'm,
been,
I'm also, yeah.
we've been reflecting on whether how we're doing that is helping. One guide we have is a map of environmental justice areas in Minnesota.
Okay.
Now, I work with people in both parties at the Capitol when we get this money, and I've found that I can get one side of the aisle to agree that this is a problem. If we talk about people having lack of access to clean water based on what their income is and what their where they live, I can talk to another group and say the reason people live where they live and have the income they have is because the lack of home equity, for example, the intergenerational transfer of wealth, the practice of redlining. And so that's why some people may live in a one of the criteria is something like 40% of people in a census tract would be people of color.
Yeah.
That's an environmental justice area. Tribal reservations are environmental justice areas, but
Yes.
also areas that have, I think it's 35% of people that are at 200% of poverty, also environmental justice areas. So it has been enlightening for a lot of people at the Capitol and the public to see that there's a huge part of rural Minnesota that also fits in that. So we're kind of all in the same boat. There is interest, I should say, and your question is going to help that discussion about whether we should insert equity as something that adds more points to a proposal, for example. Move something
Absolutely.
up there.
I don't see how you could not, since inequity has
Right.
actually been the norm. And I'm going to challenge you about science being sort of unbiased, because science is what has caused some of the problems. So it has its place, but it's not immune from implicit and explicit bias. Science has been used to manipulate things. But I think the main thing is that the communities that are being affected the most and that suffer the most harm ought to be participating in the discussion, right? And there is kind of a perception among those from the dominant culture that either we don't care or that we don't know. But there's a group called, Outdoor Afro, which, they started promoting the fact that Black people have been going outdoors and going to parks and things way before it became popular. But the perception is that we don't. I would say the same perception is around whether we care about safe water or clean water, is that there are operating stereotypes that then mitigate, and nobody goes out and reaches out to those communities, and they believe, well, the people in power don't really want us there, so why should it change, right? And so the other piece of it that I wanted to say is that I would like you to go out and see the Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, UROC. That's where I was the founding executive director. And when we renovated that space, we had an environmental landscaper. And so there were things done around the stormwater in North Minneapolis that I think it might be interesting to see 13 years later how it's holding up. But it was an example in which within that space, we were able to address some of those very issues. We reclaimed green space in both the back and the front of the building. So really, and people they almost thought that we had actually gutted the building and rebuilt it because it was so different from what they had been accustomed to in North Minneapolis. And I'm happy to say, as the founding executive director, that in that time period, 14 years later, for me to see that it is doing what it was supposed to do, it is possible. And the community was very involved in, the development of the strategic plan and all of that. So it's possible to involve community, but if people feel that they're not wanted, that they're not welcome, they may put on an air that they're not interested, but at the end of the day, it affects their lives. And we're talking about lead, we're talking about pollution. It affects the development of their children and their own physical and mental health. So I think it's really important for people to be involved, to have more participation, even if they're not on the council.
This is the
I would
Conversation
love
with Al
that.
McFarlane, talking to Paul Gardner. Paul Gardner has been the administrator of the Clean Water Council since 2019. He's served in a variety of roles in solid waste and recycling, and as a state legislator from 2007 to 2010 in the Ramsey and Anoka County suburbs. Paul, let me ask you sort of a final question here. What expectations should Minnesota have for clean water in the years to come? And if you want to kind of involve in that response, a response to some of the questions and challenges being raised by Dr. McClaurin.
Sure. And just give me the timeout when you want me to be quiet, because I could go on.
I'll bump in. Okay, go ahead.
Right. So we have been talking about what type of expectations we have. Every 2 years, a list of impaired waters comes out, which is sort of like a standardized test, which just gives you a snapshot in time of what our waters are doing. And since we look in so many places for different contaminants, that list is large, and we usually get this freak out from people saying, oh my gosh, the boundary waters are in danger and we have to do something. And I don't disagree. But we use that list to diagnose which things we got to focus on first. And it's pretty clear, because of the way we use land, we can't clean up all our waters by 2034 when this amendment expires. But we try to focus on the top priorities. I will say one weakness we do have, Dr. McClaurin, which you're right about, is that, well, you're probably right about everything, but in government, we tend to always revert to the usual suspects, the people who show up at the public meetings, who are often lobbyists, or local units of government who have somebody on professional staff who, they check their boxes on the public comment. And but it's we have been trying, and obviously we need to do better, is reaching out to community members who may want to have a little bit more learning about what that process is, so they know where to insert themselves to make comments at the right time, so it would make a difference. So many times what a public meeting is, or what it feels like to some people, is like a cake on a project that's already been baked. And so there isn't that early coordination, that early outreach where you can hear from people. And I don't know if it's just humanity or just the boxes we create for ourselves, but sometimes we don't get out of that comfort zone to reach out to people and listen. And I would say that I'm not skilled in particular knowing how to find people outside government, other than, say, an organized environmental group. So I would appreciate any heat you want to bring on me.
Well, you can call me up as a consultant. I've worked with the city of Durham. I just worked with the town of Chapel Hill, and that's what I do. And what the city of Durham did was to hold meetings in the spaces where the people are. And the critique from the town of Chapel Hill in North Carolina is that you hold these meetings, but you hold them in spaces that people don't feel comfortable in, or they can't get access to. So the city of Durham actually did, it's called Engage Durham. It was their comprehensive planning. And they basically said, we're not going to use the usual suspects. If they show up, it's okay, but that's not who we're going to target to reach out to, right? And they have done, I think, a fabulous job, but it took concerted effort. It took them changing the paradigm, of what is normative. And sometimes you just need people who can guide you through that, and so it's not that people aren't experts, but there's some things you can't be expert in. And I think the way that the university that we went around developing UROC, we held community meetings in the community. We have, futures conference. What is the future of clean water? What do people in the community want to see? What does that even mean in their mindset? Because what you may mean by clean water and what they may mean by clean water might be two different things, right? So I think trying to find ways to do that. So I'm available.
Well, let me shift a little bit before we close out. I got a press release today from Clean Heat Minnesota. The press release said that Clean Heat Minnesota is launching a coalition to kickstart transition for heating, cooking appliances, and that Clean Heat Minnesota is a growing statewide multiracial coalition that represents Minnesotans who want clean, affordable energy to power heating, cooking, and appliances in homes, schools, and workplaces, that they're launching with this mission of ensuring thoughtful, equitable energy transition across Minnesota's building sector. The coalition is committed to centering consumers and reliable Midwest-made energy. So how do the principles of that defining statement translate to clean water? I know that you are an advocate in that arena as well. What are your thoughts?
Just in my own community, I'm trying to get people to take advantage of all the incentives that Senator Tina Smith, who you're going to talk to, has put in place for people to switch to heat pump water heaters, heat pumps, energy efficiency, and the like, because that benefits everybody to have lower energy costs. I mean, that we will save all kinds of money as a country, particularly for those of modest means, through those incentives. But there are places where climate and water intersect. So when we have prolonged drought, we're very concerned about our groundwater reserves. Groundwater in the metro area is connected to surface water. So if our local lakes are low, sometimes it means the springs and the groundwater may be depleted as well. So we're worried about that. In agriculture, we're trying to help farmers keep from tilling their soil and put cover crops in when they're not growing their cash crop. That holds the soil, but it sequesters carbon, which helps reduce our carbon emissions. And so sometimes things that are good for climate are good for water. Another case is, actually, this is in Minneapolis. Climate resilience is an issue. So it's not just about reducing carbon emissions. There's a park, I think it's east of Dinkytown, that looks kind of like a sunken amphitheater among all these new apartment buildings. And when it rains, the stormwater goes into that sunken area. So it's a park most of the time, but when it rains like today, it fills up with water, and then the water infiltrates into the ground. So the contaminants still go into the Mississippi River. But the rest of the time, it's a park. So there are lots of interesting ways where you don't have a lot of space, where focusing on the climate and the increased precipitation that we're going to get and warmer temperatures can be alleviated by dealing with stormwater in an innovative way.
Let me break you now because Senator Smith is here. Before we go, thank you so much. And hang around because maybe we've got about 15 minutes with the senator in her schedule. You can react to some of her concerns as well. Before we join her, we'll take this message of our supporter and we'll come right back. Are you or someone you know recovering financially from the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown, or any other reason? If so, help is available. Findhelp.org is a site to find a wide range of resources, including food, medical care, and more. The best part is based on your zip code. Visit findhelp.org, enter your zip code and the service you need. You'll get a map directing you to the organizations that can help you. Help is waiting at findhelp.org. If you need help starting anew, findhelp.org is the site for you. I'm Al McFarlane. This is the Conversation with Al McFarlane. Let's invite in Senator Tina Smith. Senator Smith, good to see you again. How are you?
I'm well. It's so nice to see you. Dr. McClaurin, nice to see you too.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. You know, we're talking generally about clean water, and, you know, Dr. Irma and I were talking about too often that question is seen as a white question, not a black question, or our communities get left out of the discussion or presumed to not be interested in it because of the construction of decision-making and benefit. We get left out. You've heard me say this too often, that they get the money, we get the misery. And so how do we change that dynamic? And what I want to do with you in this conversation, Senator Smith, is start talking about farming and Black people farming, and in that sense, the environment and clean water all tied into how we reimagine what equity is across the board. So Farm Bill is something that you're concerned about. Let's start there.
Yeah. Well, oh gosh, I so appreciate this conversation and there's so many different ways to go about this. But if we want to think about bringing equity to the Farm Bill, and what impact that can have in Minnesota and around the country. I mean, it's really, really huge. So I usually start from the place that, 100 years ago, there were roughly, 1 million Black farmers in the country. That number has dropped dramatically as we have seen Black farmers lose control over land and be moved off of the land And because they lost land, they also lost equity, and they lost wealth, and the deep systemic inequities in the whole system have just been exacerbated. And let's be honest, the USDA the U.S. Department of Agriculture was not traditionally a friend to those who were working to solve that problem. In fact, our current Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, who's from Iowa, this was the very first thing that I talked to him about when he came into my office to discuss his confirmation, because it is so important that this doesn't move to just being a talking point for leaders in the administration and in the Senate and in Congress overall, but it becomes an action plan for what to do. And so in the current Farm Bill that we're working very hard on to pass, that means specifically, what can we do to increase access to land and to capital for small farmers, beginning farmers, Black farmers, other farmers of color, so that they have an opportunity to own land. They also have opportunity to participate in some of the core Farm Bill programs, which have, again, traditionally gone to larger farmers and have blocked out smaller farmers and farmers of color. You know, a couple of months ago, I guess it was, I did a roundtable discussion at the food hub in St. Paul, and it was specifically focused on Black farmers and farmers of color, talking about what their challenges were and what we need to do to be responsive to them. And it was fantastic. We learned so much. Farmers that some of them are doing urban agriculture, some of them out in small towns and rural places, and they had really great ideas for what can be done. So we listen to those ideas and we try to put them into practice.
And Senator, could I just add to that? I think what most people think when they think about farm, and I'm sort of I'm in New Orleans now, but I've been staying in Mobile, Alabama, and Mobile is just outside of Mobile. There's the Jenkins Farm. And just to show you the kind of interest, I did a TikTok. It's 1,000 acres. It's a Black farm.
Yeah.
The family, the son is a friend of a colleague of mine when I worked at the Ford Foundation. So I just drove up there to see it, and it's amazing. I did a little TikTok there. That TikTok has gotten over 2,300 views. You know, because when I say this is a historic Black farm, people are like, what?
Yeah.
And so people think that and when I listened to their story and what they had to go to retain that land, it wasn't just about ownership. It wasn't just about working the land, but it's about, they actually had to get a contract with a gas, one of these, I think it was one of the oil companies. They went directly to them to get a gas because they could not get gas for their tractors from the white merchants. So they ended up having to do a private kind of deal. So it's not just about the land and working the land, it's all those pieces that go into making it a viable business. That is important. Who are you going to sell your products to if you produce them? How are you going to get them to the market if you don't have gasoline, if people aren't selling you that? There's so many aspects of it that people don't realize when we talk about the dearth of Black farmers, how much more complicated it is.
Senator?
Yes, that's so true.
Yeah. And so go ahead. So how do we, number one, sort of reinvigorate the mind of the Black community so it sees itself as a player in the question of farming, both urban and traditional farming? And then what are you doing with the Farm Bill in particular that addresses this and creates opportunity?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, it's an interesting and it's a complicated question, but here are a couple of ideas that I have, and I'm really these are the ideas that I have picked up from talking to Black entrepreneurs and leaders working on agriculture in Minnesota and around the country. And what I hear is that a lot of what motivates them is wanting to help reconnect people to food and where their food comes from. And so many of them are driven. I mean, they farming has to be a for-profit enterprise for the most part,
Sure.
But they're really driven by that food land community connection. And so we need to be thinking about how can we support that. The food sector is highly concentrated. It is very difficult for small farmers in general to figure out how to do well in this system, which is so controlled by big corporate interests, whether it is on the processing side, or where you buy your seed and your fertilizer, or who owns the land, or how big a farm has to be supposedly in order to succeed. And so the first thing I would say is just, listening to and then bringing forward the ideas of the great entrepreneurs that I know of in Minneapolis and St. Paul and really all across the state. The other thing I want to mention, because you were talking with Paul Gardner about issues around climate and energy and water, is that we passed in 2021 one of the most substantial climate action pieces of legislation ever in our history. That climate change legislation can become another source of revenue and opportunity for small farmers, for Black farmers who are, it becomes another diverse form of income. So for example, just think about it. I have been a strong supporter of the program that helps farmers put solar panels or wind turbines on their property, helping to lower their energy costs. As you're saying, Dr. Irma, figuring out how to pay for your energy costs can be expensive. And then that also then becomes another source of revenue for farmers as well. If they have, this would be for people who have some land that they are, that they have some control over. So the first part is like reconnecting to this issue of land and food and how we can support local food, regional food economies, which is going to benefit often Black farmers. And then the second thing is how the work that we've done around climate and clean energy and issues around carbon sequestration and healthy soil can be another source of revenue for farmers.
Let me switch a little bit. You were one of the speakers at the annual State Martin Luther King Jr. Day event where the theme was Building Black Wealth. And since you've hosted a panel on building Black wealth in Minnesota, you've chaired hearings focused on how to better support community development financial institutions as a key driver of repairing economic disparity for communities of color. And recently you were invited by MinnPost to be part of their panel on Black entrepreneurship. So where does your focus on this work stem from? What drives you to continue working on it? And you certainly can build that into the responses you've given already.
Yeah. Well, so when I spoke at the Martin Luther King Day events, I wanted to draw attention, how can I put, to a lot of people really are very connected to what Dr. King wrote and talked about in terms of civil rights. And of course, we all should be. But people tend to forget how Dr. King's work was really around economic justice. I mean, the work that he did was the very beginning of the Poor People's Campaign, and saying that our economy has to work for people no matter who you are. And so I wanted to kind of keep on working on that and pushing on that to sort of break through people's comfort level a little bit around what it is that Dr. King really talked about, the work that Dr. King did with labor unions to try to make our economy work better for working people. And then the work around that we did in my subcommittees, and then the MinnPost hearing and the roundtable I had on building Black wealth. And again, those conversations have been so interesting because they're focused on people in the community who've been doing this work and have to tell us and teach us about what works and what's not. At the MinnPost event, we had it was moderated by the indomitable Shaletta Brundage, who had everybody running around in circles, thinking about what this really means and opening up the eyes of a lot of people in the audience. It was mostly a white audience, about what some of the barriers are to Black entrepreneurs seeking access to the kinds of basic, loans and lending and capital that a lot of white small businesses take for granted. And helping people to see those barriers and then think about what can we do specifically to break them down. I'll just mention that a week or two ago, we held a really great hearing on the subcommittee that I chair, looking at the role of community CDFIs, community development financial institutions, which can be very powerful institutions for helping expand access to capital and lending to small businesses of color and also individuals who are really struggling to get the attention of some of the big financial institutions. At the MinPost roundtable that we did, I was on the roundtable with Houston White and with Anissa Keys, and Anissa did such a great job in particular of talking about what it's like as a Black woman to go into banks and try to understand, like, what do I need to do to improve my credit rating so that you will loan me money so that I can do what I know how to do.
Mhm.
And I think it demonstrated some of the big needs that we have and some of the solutions ahead of us in terms of helping CDFIs, especially smaller CDFIs, so they can do the work that we need to do. And we've got some good examples of that in Minnesota.
And I would just add to that is, I'm thinking about, you mentioned Dr. King, and I'm thinking about the line in his I Have a Dream where he talks about that America has given, Black people a check marked insufficient, a bad check marked insufficient funds. And so my question is around Black farming, whether it's also about, community development funds, which we had decades of those, and many of them did not survive. Is reparations something in there for Black farmers? Is that something that is realistic to think? And then how do we begin to, we never got the 40 acres and a mule, so they also owe us that as well. But how do we get kids who are raised in urban areas to understand that having land and being part of the land is important? I don't see schools doing that, and particularly in communities of color.
Right.
I know you've got about a minute or so before you leave, Senator, but go ahead.
No, thank you, Al. But it's such a good question, Dr. Irma. And, when we passed I think it was the American Rescue Plan, my colleagues Cory Booker and Ralph Warnock included in that legislation something that it wasn't called reparations, but it looked a lot like repairing the damage that had been done to Black farmers that took something that was theirs.
Yeah.
And the grave, the damage done by enslaving their ancestors. And I was so proud to support that legislation. And it essentially went right at how can we provide grants to Black farmers in order to buy land so that we can start to repair that damage. Now, unfortunately, the courts declared that unconstitutional.
Right.
And not a surprise, I would say, given the way many of our courts are, not all of them right now. So we're continuing to see what work we can do in the Farm Bill to come at that in another way. But the more I work on these issues, whether it is farming or whether it is home ownership or whether it is, there's so many different places where I feel as if our mission is to think about repairing the past damage done in a very mindful and specific way. And that's what reparations means.
Senator, you also are concerned about child care stabilization funding that was provided but has ended. Let's have you reflect on that before you have to leave.
I was just talking with all of my colleagues at lunch today on the Democratic side about this importance. In the pandemic, we nearly, huge crisis in childcare. Many facilities went out of business, especially small family-run businesses, home-run businesses. A lot of those were Black women, Latino women, indigenous women who lost their businesses, and the community lost those childcare spots. What we did is we put billions of dollars into grants to stabilize the childcare facilities that were left so that they could be used to pay for salaries and make improvements in people's facilities. And those grants ended on September 30th, creating this huge cliff in funding. And so my passion is to, in the emergency funding spending bills that we're working on right now, to include additional funding for childcare so that we can protect as many of those childcare spots as we can, while we still do the hard work we need to do to really systematically change the way childcare works so that we're not always in an emergency like we have been over the last several years.
Senator Smith, thank you so much. Always good to see you, and you're welcome here anytime.
Well, thank you very much. And Al, before I leave, I noticed I have on my phone information about the Black Men's Legacy Summit that I know is coming up, so I can't hold it in front of the camera there.
Yep.
So that sounds very exciting, coming up on October 28th. And
Right.
Build Wealth Minnesota, I think this is the spokesman recorder that is doing this. And so
No, Inside News.
Pardon me, Inside News. Yeah, that's great.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. We've been promoting that all week long in advance of the event, and it's an important event. We want to change the dialogue, change the narrative in our community about wealth, and make it so it's our dinner conversation, our water cooler conversation, our tennis court and basketball court conversation. How do we build wealth? How do we understand the legacy of wealth building and the importance of co-creating a future that allows our people to see ourselves as winners? So that's it. Senator, thank you so much. We'll see you next time.
Good to see you both.
All right. And then Irma, and let's bring our other guest back in here. If he's still here, I think he's here. Yeah. Paul, we got a few minutes just to react. Thank you for hanging out with us, Paul. And Irma, I know you have more questions to ask, but I wanted to make sure that I got all the ones in that I had scheduled to ask. But it's a good time to do reflections. Any additional thoughts on what she did say and what you wanted her to say?
I see a connection, and I'm thinking, so how do you take childcare and children who've been so used to an urban environment and introduce them to Black farms? Mm-hmm. How are Black farms being affected by, clean water? Mm-hmm. Is there something that they can do to sort of mitigate against, pollution and things of that nature? And so, I'm seeing connections, in that particular way. But I think, the fact that people are still trying to find ways to do reparative, not reparations, but repair, just repair the damage that's been done is really important. And I'm looking forward to seeing, where Paul goes in the future, because I think involving communities in conversation about clean water is absolutely vital. Absolutely vital.
Well, I'm interested, Paul, in knowing and supporting any efforts that you may create or see that intentionally invite and include Black urban communities to be part of the discussion, to have familiarity, number one, and to be able to articulate their own issues in the context of the history and also in the context of the opportunity to be part of the solution, not just victims of prior mismanagement or misguided policy that has put us where we are in the point of crisis in air and water and energy. So what kinds of things are I think you were mentioning one or two things before the senator came on that are happening that are urban. What more are you concerned? Are you working with to have activity in this area?
Sure. So at the council's behest, we actually got $1 million set aside this last funding cycle for not the usual suspects. So half of it, we worked with the Board of Water and Soil Resources to dedicate it towards tribal governments. So there were 3 grants for that around the state. But the other half of that $1 million was dedicated towards nonprofit organizations, 501c3s, and they actually come from all parts of the state. But the one that we did make a grant to, and I would looking forward to visiting them soon, is Spark Y. They're in Minneapolis, but they're going to carry out 3 river first projects that advance urban stormwater remediation goals while empowering.
If you have their website up, you can share it. You want to share it?
Yeah, somewhere.
There should be an opportunity for you to share. I think you can. Maybe you
I'll put in the name of the group.
Yeah, Spark Y. Okay.
But they received a grant for several $100,000 to engage several hundred youth into addressing stormwater issues in the city of Minneapolis.
Okay.
You have a very active group called the Mississippi Watershed or Mississippi Water Management Organization in Minneapolis. They got a direct appropriation from the city, and they use some clean water funds, but they have been doing a lot of work in the northern half of Minneapolis to help green up that part of town, and while still meeting stormwater goals. And so they've done a lot of outreach to diverse communities there. We generally, at the Clean Water Council, give money to groups so that they can do the stuff in their own communities. But I would love to have a broader dialogue about issues facing the Black community. I think that would be fascinating for starters.
And I think
I grew up in a southern state, and when I came to Minnesota, I said, wow, I feel like we're like 30 years back over.
I think the main thing in having conversations with communities is that the people who have the resources need to come to listen, not to present, but to listen and to hear what's really the questions, and then what's behind the questions, and then what are they not saying and talking about, and then reflect on the ways in which your processes or the way that you present your material in some ways, oftentimes stops the conversation, because people come as experts and we want to tell you what's going on.
Right.
And you really need to come to listen. And that takes facilitation. And sometimes it takes people who are outside of the sort of stakeholders who don't have a stake in it, who can then facilitate that because they're not invested in the same way. So I would encourage you to think about having community conversations, but with the understanding that once people give you that information, what are you going to do with it? Because people want to see some tangible results.
Right.
And that was my experience.
Well,
and
before you answer, Paul, what I said to Senator Smith, too often we get the misery and white people get the money. So how do we change that? How do we change that so that when you come, as Irma said, to our community, not only is it, it should not be coming to pontificate or to lecture, but coming to listen. The listening should include an attitude that encourages and fosters and supports solution making, and that is intentional in analyzing or transparent in describing the revenue streams associated with problem solving, because that's where the rubber meets the road. How many jobs get created? How many businesses get built? How many careers get launched? And how can sustainability show up where there's equity and a sense of stewardship about a public trust like water, right? That also is a revenue driver for any community or society. How do we make sure that we're at the decision table, at pulling the levers to make sure that the flow comes through our systems as well?
And I would add to that, look at who you've given grants to. And if out of all the grants you've given, only a handful are really in the communities that are being affected, then you've got a problem with your process, okay? Because often what happens is that the very structure that you create is a barrier itself. And so you need to look at who's been getting the grants, what kind of resources do they have? And it is usually the usual suspects. It's the same old people who are constantly, and because they sort of know how to do it. And so you've got to shift that. You've got to shift the paradigm. You've got to step outside the boxes. You've got to create sort of alternative ways of doing it so that you do really open up the space instead of saying, oh, but we gave like 5 grants to people of color, but the other 95 went to the usual suspects. Then you really haven't made any change. All you've done is tokenism. So I think really committing to having that analysis of your own process and doing the internal work. But it takes someone who is outside of that to be able to see what you can't see. They say it's not a fish that knows that it's swimming in the ocean, right? Sometimes it can't see because it's in it, right? So I think being cognizant of that, and there's so many groups of color, indigenous groups in particular, bringing their voices in. I know what the representation of Native Americans are in Minneapolis, and yet it is the most invisible population that I've ever seen. And that makes no sense because the whole state owes itself to indigenous people. They were the stewards of the lands, the rivers, way before white settlers came. And we need to find a way to bring them back into the conversation, because maybe there's something that can be learned from what they did, and how they see the land and how they see the water and those kinds of things. So my soapbox.
Well, I love it. I will say that there is a philosophical change happening. Of course, it's never enough, but the idea of incorporating indigenous knowledge into water management is now a thing. It's not as widespread as it could be, but at least at my agency, they're thinking very deeply about it. We have had tribes say many times, "You guys just come when you need to, and you check the boxes." So
And
what you said hits home. We've definitely heard that.
So when I was at the Ford Foundation in 2005, I funded at Lewis and Clark the Indigenous Ways of Knowing project. And what was compelling about it is that while it was a white woman who presented it, she had the backing of all the tribal leaders, and she had done the work. And then she would facilitate and move herself away so that it really was their project. I think, and that's what people don't understand, is that sometimes once you get it going, you need to know how to move out of the way so that people really can, be able to do the work. And I think that's very hard, but I think it's a necessary part. But that's good to hear, because indigenous knowledge is vital. And also that with many of the African groups that we have, people have spiritualisms that is very much rooted in worshiping and celebrating water. So it's not just indigenous Native American, but also people whose basis in African spiritualism is rooted in sort of spirit, water orishas and things of that nature that we need to recognize.
Yeah, the natural world. Well, listen, this has been a great conversation. Thank you, as always, Dr. Irma McClaurin. Thank you, Paul Gardner. You got about a minute for a final word. If you've got projects you want to invite people to be aware of or to come to, this is a good time to say it.
Well, we actually are going through a strategic planning process right now, and several of our members have said we need to talk about equity. So I'm looking forward to doing that. I will just say I'm not skilled at that, and so I'm going to need some help to figure out how to navigate that conversation and figure out how to ask the right questions.
Ask the experts. There are those of us who are out there have been doing it for a long time.
And we also have been cast a wide net. Anyone who will listen for input on where we got to put dollars in the next round. We're doing recommendations that will come out at the end of next year, but we start hearing presentations and things in March or so. But I would definitely take some of your comments to heart and present those to the council and see where that conversation goes. And I'd love to follow up with you.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. This is the Conversation with Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.